Welcome to Paddlecast with Betsy
and Billy. On Paddlecast, we talk to and about paddlers who are pushing limits, paddlers who are pushing their own limits and pushing the limits of paddle sports.
We have to start today with a Devizes to Westminster debrief. So Easter weekend was one of the biggest races of the year in the UK and probably the most competitive and high-level race in DW history, definitely in recent memory. We always knew that this was going to be a tight race, but it was truly a nail-biter until the very last minutes, which was just incredible to be a part of. I had the pleasure of live streaming almost the entire event, which you can find on YouTube. And Billy, you were out there racing.
I did. I had the pleasure of doing it.
As much as you can call doing DW a pleasure.
That's true, yeah.
The top three results. So in first place, we had Tom Sharpe and Anoushka Freeman. They were probably our favorites going in, but there was still, again, doubt until those last few minutes. So Tom and Nishi managed to double up on their win from last year. So they've done it twice in a row now. Incredibly impressive. Their winning time was 17 hours, 17 minutes, and 23 seconds. Behind them by about 4 minutes was Joe Peterson and Brindy Kraft. So they took that second place slot, literally only 4 minutes behind them. And then another 4 minutes, just under 4 minutes in third place, was Jon O'Grady with Paddlecast's own Billy Butler. Congratulations again, Billy.
Thank you very much.
So today we are going to talk about the race from more of a high-level view, and then we'll take you behind the scenes to hear from the crews about their races. Even though I was watching the race the whole time, there was actually a lot that these crews shared that I didn't realize was happening, and in some ways made their results even more impressive. So let's start in Devizes, because one of the first things that I noticed about this year compared to last year was that the dynamics between what was going on between those top crews at the start were pretty different this year compared to last year. So, Billy, can you talk about what was going on behind the scenes?
So, for those that don't know, one of the things that makes DW unique is that you need to choose your start time based on your predicted time to reach the tidal Thames. The tideway starts about 17 miles from a finish, and you have a 2.5 hour window of which to make that point. Choosing the right start time can make or break your race. So last year, Jon O'Grady and I decided we wanted to chase, which meant we wanted to go last. And it got very late at Devizes. Tom, Simmons and Andy Birkett set off, and then we jumped on the water not long after that. This year, we decided that we didn't want to chase and we wanted to go early and do our own thing. We had some discussions in the week previously with David Horkan and Dan Palmer being slight outsiders. And we came up with a plan to go slightly earlier than the others, work together well, and hopefully that would be enough to maybe for one of us or maybe for both of us to get on the podium.
That strategy seemed to work for you, so that was a good call.
Well, it worked for us. Unfortunately for David and Dan, they had some issues down the course. We think it helped us. It's a shame that it didn't work for longer. Really, for the plan to really work, we wanted it to be happening on the Thames, and it fell apart at the second checkpoint about 3.5 hours in. It would have been really interesting if they didn't have those issues. What would have happened? It maybe could have been completely different. We will never know, and that's the fun of it.
So just like you and John were talking to Dan and David in the lead up, those top three crews had actually collaborated or plotted their own start times beforehand this time, right?
Yeah, I think they were just all trying to make sure they stayed friends at the end of the race. With every member of a crew being at the same club, they had to have some diplomacy over it. But yeah, they agreed to start 10 minutes apart. On the actual day, it didn't quite work like that, but that's the way it goes. Sometimes you have a panic and needed to put an extra base layer on, or you decide you need to put an extra bit of pseudo creme somewhere, or I don't know. Yeah, they actually started with Andy and Tom at 5:27, Joe and Brindy at 5:35, and Tom and Nushi 14 minutes later at 5:49.
So close to their original 10-minute gaps that they planned.
Pretty close to their original gaps. Although actually, if they had have done a 10-minute gap further down the course, Tom and Nushi could have caught Joe and Brindy, and that really would have changed dynamics.
I do think that's an interesting question. And watching those dynamics at the start, for me, getting to watch it a second year in a row after last year where it was this total game of chicken, right? It was like, who's going to go first? How long is everyone going to wait? I think it was well after 6 p.m. when you and Jon started.
I think it was bang on 6, but yeah, it was late. It was too late.
Yeah, and then this year, for me watching, it felt like a very different vibe. It did feel a lot more under control and calm. I'm not sure if I would go quite so far as to say chilled out, but definitely like there was a little bit less stress since people had kind of committed to these plans a bit more beforehand.
Yeah, I still didn't believe that would all happen like that. I was very relaxed at Devizes, but I think that's just experience of being there. I remember, my first couple, I remember being quite nervous, but it's now not as stressful.
As we said, they didn't perfectly stick to schedule. And it was interesting watching, the time tick past. I believe it was 5:25 p.m. was when Andy and Tom were meant to go off. And the clock was ticking. And I did notice the other crews kind of watching them, waiting for them to go. I think they did start to get a little bit nervous that maybe that plan they had agreed to was at risk. But they all went off roughly around the times that they'd committed to. The one crew who was kind of playing that game of chicken was Bob Poole and Steve Tebbett. And they had not been part of these previous planning discussions. They were just kind of hanging out on site, waiting until after, Billy, you and Jon had gone already with David and Dan, who probably Bob and Steve were a little bit closer to when we look at those waterside times. But they waited around until Andy and Tom went. And I think it's fair to say that decision cost them a finish, because they ended up having a tough time out there, and they got pulled off the course just after Teddington because they weren't making those time cutoffs.
I think you're right with that observation. If they'd have started with us, that would have been quite a few boats to get down the course altogether. If they'd have started an hour earlier, they'd have been fine.
And they could have, if you guys had passed them at any point too, if they'd started shortly before you can catch a wash. And I think that was one of the challenges of starting so late with only 2 boats starting behind you, is the only washes that they could catch early in the race were people who were going quite a bit faster than them. So I think they did get some good wash hanging in, but not quite enough to make up for that late start.
Yeah, I think that's pretty correct. Yeah.
So you and Jon left early. We talked about it. It wasn't quite that 10-minute difference between Andy, Tom, Brindy, Joe, and Tom Nushi. How do you think those start times, the way that they shook out, affected the race further down the course?
None of them caught each other on the water until Joe and Brindy caught Tom and Andy quite far down Shepperton Way, somewhere like that. So that was all fine. Tom and Nushi very nearly caught Joe and Brindy at Fobney, which would have made things very interesting.
The mindset of being in front of people, risking getting caught, versus being behind people with the chance to overtake. It does kind of affect your motivation a bit, right?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah.
We mentioned the issues that Dan and David had. So you and Jon started with Dan and David. How did things play out after that start?
Thank you for Tango Charlie Lights for sponsoring this episode. I'm particularly happy about this because I love the product. I use my Tango Charlie Lights day to day whenever I'm paddling in the dark. Most of my paddling is in a busy shipping lane, so it's vitally important that I'm seen. I've also used them on big adventures that I've done around Anglesey and across the North Sea. On both occasions, I started in the dark. I used the green and red navigation lights on the back, and I used the big front light to allow me to see any waves. The favourite part of Tango Charlie lights for me is they have a variety of options to suit every application, and they suit every type of boat that I have, surf skis and K1s. If you want to learn more about the lights and other accessories that Tango Charlie has, go to tangocharlielights.com.au.
We had a good run down the first section with no portages, often called the pound. And then we got to the first lock and we trotted over that quite well. And as we pushed off, we heard a load of commotion and we didn't fully know what was going on. But it turns out that Dan and David's rudder wires had come off the wheel and they had no steering. And we decided that the best thing to do was wait, because we wanted this plan to work on the Thames, down on the bigger water. We worked together again to Hungerford, the second checkpoint. At the Hungerford portage, Dan and David's rudder went again. We pushed off from the portage and again heard a load of commotion, and the language was a lot more colourful this time. I turned around and saw the nose of a boat in the bank, at which point I said to Jon, if it's gone again, it will go repeatedly. So we pushed on.
Well, they ended up, I was able to ask David Horkan about their race a little bit afterwards, and he did confirm he thinks it cost them at least 20 minutes, if not more, just kind of dealing with those rudder problems. And I saw them go through, Dreadnought Reach as well. And all of us who were commentating just looked at their boat, and the rudder was just, flapping in the breeze. It was amazing that they made it all the way down the course. Probably the vast majority of crews, if they had been facing a similar situation, would have just, called it and said, look, this is too much, too hard. We're not going to make it down. But Dan and David finished the race, and they finished well as well. I think it was 5th place overall.
Yeah, that's a good finish. I would have been very surprised if that crew would have dropped out.
I think David did say, as they were fixing the rudder, someone said 100 miles to go, and he thought that they could be done in that moment. You've got a broken rudder and 100 miles ahead of you. How do you pull through?
Yeah.
But they steeled themselves and made it through, and that's pretty impressive. And they weren't the only boat that had issues. We heard from both Tom and Nushi and Joe and Brindy that they ended up having some issues too, right?
They had some issues. They both had stomach issues. And it's a long race, and there's lots of bugs that you can pick up along the way. That might have been it. Might have just been race stress. We don't know, but we'll talk to them later. But yeah, they didn't have the best rundowns, which I think benefited me and Jon. It meant we got much closer than our waterside results indicated that we would. It was very unpleasant for Tom and Nushi, Joe and Brindy, but made the race a lot better for everyone at home, and gave me a better weekend.
Well, you guys had a really good race regardless.
Yeah.
You mentioned the role of the support crews too. I think a lot of people who follow this race, understand that it's support, and there's, people who will come along the course and feed you, but especially the importance of the support crew at the top end for those teams who've ended up on the podium and close to it. That support crew can make a really big difference.
Yeah, definitely. The support crew is a major part. People underestimate it. And it's not just standing on the side handing food, when paddlers want it. A real top end support crew will keep you ticking when you don't realize that you're dropping off. And a good example would have been fairly early in the race. We were probably somewhere near Newbury. Jon and I paddled into a portage, and I came off the gas ever so slightly earlier than I would have done normally, and drifted into the portage slightly slower. Didn't need to hit the brakes quite as hard. And at the time we had Alex Lane on a bike. Alex Lane is a former winner and she is the ladies' record holder. And she called me out on it immediately. She said, "Billy, that was too slow. Pick it up on the next one." Just that one. It meant that we lost a couple of seconds on that portage, but then it didn't happen again. It's just keeping paddlers on track like that can turn into minutes. It's not just keep you fed. It's stuff like that makes or breaks a race.
77 portages,
Yeah.
just a few seconds per portage. That really adds up.
Yeah. If I'd have started doing that every one, we wouldn't have been in the race for as long as we were.
It definitely pays off to have a DW winner on your support crew. And you guys weren't the only ones with DW winners on your support crew. I think Tom and Nishi had 2 in their crew. So maybe that was part of what gave them the extra advantage. For Tom and Nishi, was that Lizzie Broughton and Steve Baker?
Yeah, that was multiple winner and unofficial record holder Steve Baker, and the first ever mixed crew winner and mixed record holder Lizzie Broughton. And Tom and Andy had DW 2022 winner Mike Laverack.
That definitely has to make a difference. I think the story you shared about Alex Lane and how she was able to understand, your headspace and what you needed as a racer in that moment. That's what's getting these teams, every little second.
Yeah, it wouldn't work for every crew. Alex was a hard taskmaster, and not everyone would respond well to it. But Jon and I, we did. Jon and I had a really good race that went pretty much perfectly to plan. We could only find 2 or 3 incidents where we could have saved time. Tom and Andy's race seemed pretty much to go to plan, but you spoke to them to the finish, and they did have some issues. What was that?
Yeah, I think they had a really hard time in the last section of the race. And when we talked about Andy Birkett and Tom Simmons as a crew in our preview episode, we had said, if everything goes to plan for them, we think that they could be the winners. I'm not aware of them having any major issues like, the stomach issues, vomiting, or rudder issues or anything that some of the other crews had. But I think it was still a tough race for them. Getting passed by Joe and Brindy, I think at Shepperton probably made a big difference in just their sort of motivation and headspace, especially since they had started several minutes ahead of them and maybe expected to be winning against them at that point. But they, at the end of the day, I think they were still both really happy to get to Westminster. I know Tom Simmons was really after that DW finish after they ended up having to retire last year. And Andy Birkett, even though he had a DW finish from a few years ago, where I think he won as well, he wanted the Westminster finish because his win was at Teddington. So I think they were pretty happy to get the finish and get there in a very respectable and impressive 4th place.
Yeah, they did well, and they were fairly true to form.
We did see Joe and Brindy ahead of them at Waterside D. And so I'm sure they knew that was a possibility. And of course, Tom and Nishi coming in with the experience of having won the previous year. I think, Billy, you and Jon almost exceeded even your own expectations in the race, maybe in part just because everything went perfectly to plan.
Yeah, everything went perfectly to plan. We ran to what I'd have said was almost like the top end of our schedule. And it did mean that we hit the tideway earlier than I expected. I really expected the wind to play more of a part. We hit at 4 minutes after high water, so we weren't too bad, but it would have been very nice to be half an hour later. So maybe we should have started half an hour later, but that's the gamble you take.
It was really interesting because this year, we wanted to talk about our overwhelming impressions of this year and how it was a different DW compared to other years. And we did see that a lot of crews did not make those time cutoffs and maybe had written schedules that were closer to trying to hit sort of the middle or end of the tide window and then ran behind schedule. So the fact that you guys ended up early, even if it maybe cost you a few minutes on the tideway, definitely seems like it was the better approach to take, particularly with the headwind this year.
Yeah, definitely. I think that, it maybe cost us a couple of minutes, but it didn't cost us the race.
What do you think were your sort of impressions of this year compared to previous years?
So for me, it was a welcome return to normality. The last two editions of a race have been pretty dicey with huge flow. You know, there was a real element of safety in both the previous two editions. And whilst there wasn't any extra risks taken this year, it wasn't something that had to be at the forefront of your mind all the time. The portages were dry, the night was a bit lighter, the flow was manageable. It was just a nice standard race. Maybe just people need to be more aware of scheduling, and the attrition rate of this year's race would have improved dramatically.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the scheduling too was if anyone had done the race in 2023 or 2024 and maybe not done it as much previously or used that data in their schedule, there's a lot of flow getting you down the course. And so you had to really adjust your time expectations for a much more standard level of flow. Plus, a little bit of that headwind. It seems like some of the crews relied a little bit too heavily on the data that had higher flow, or if they had done their training paddles as well
Yeah.
when the river had higher flow over the winter and used that data, that might have had an impact too.
Yeah, that was exactly what I was about to say. Is if anyone was on the Thames sort of 4 to 6 weeks ago doing training paddles, and they take an average speed from those days, then it's going to really skew your scheduling for the tideway.
That was one of the biggest surprises this year to me, was the really high attrition rate. And
Yeah.
this year it was 51.6%, I think. I did go back into the historical data in Jon O'Grady's database, and it looks like 2025 will have been one of the top 5 years in terms of that high attrition. So it was 2003, 2008, 1983, and 1970 were the other years, at least in recent memory, that had similarly high attrition rates around or above that 50% mark.
It didn't feel like that type of race for me. And I think that when you look at everything that we've got available to us now in terms of kit and lights and how we can prepare for the race, I don't think the attrition rate should be that high. So, Betsy, you live streamed the whole event, so you saw this. Who were the crews that got affected by this attrition rate?
It was crews who I found surprising to some degree. We mentioned Bob Poole and Steve Tebbett. I think we did know that was a risk for them from when they took off, and that their retirement was probably more related to their start time than the conditions. The Canadian canoe pair, the C2 pair of Thornton and Bowen, they ended up retiring around Marsh. So that's around the halfway point of the race. They had a swim and had trouble warming up. We did hear that breeze kind of stuck around through the night. It didn't go away. And, if you're wet and you also have that headwind coming at you, that does make things tougher. But, Mike Thornton is a racer who's completed the DW 3 times. He won the senior doubles in K2 in 1993, won the Canadian class in 2013. He's an experienced racer. And then the Texas canoe, the 2 Texans had come back after racing in 2023, and they ended up getting swamped later on down the course, and they didn't finish. Lee Maddox and Nick Perkins pulled out due to injury. Nick got a pretty significant knee injury between Newbury and Aldermaston relatively early in the race. Rebecca Bird and Al Pipe were the favorites for the Century Cup. They ended up getting some injuries, and they kept paddling, but with the injuries just didn't quite manage to make the cutoff times on the tideway. And then Vicky Metcalf is an absolute legend of DW who's done the race 12 times. And even Vicky, her team ended up having to pull out. I think for her, it was related to her partner, who's Damon White, becoming a bit unwell and having to pull out because of that. But Vicky did say, maybe the headwind played a role. It's hard to say if perhaps these paddlers were a little bit more susceptible to injuries because of that headwind and it being harder work down the course. But for Vicky and Damon, they were spot on schedule. So they did do their scheduling correctly. And it was Vicky who brought up the year 2003. She said that was her first DW and the conditions were similar. She said, the weather was foul. It was not great conditions. She thought in 2003 that the headwind would stop when it got dark. It didn't. At least this year, she knew what to expect. She knew that headwind was going to keep going, but it was still a tough time. And just the variation in temperature too, where for Vicky and Damon, they started in the rain, then it got kind of hot and sunny, then it got cold and breezy. For the teams who started earlier in the day as well, they will have faced more variation in weather conditions than, the crews who started later. So it definitely seems like it was a pretty high injury rate, possibly affected by that headwind, and probably some teams affected by that planning too. But you've done the race a lot, Billy. How much of a role does that scheduling play, and what do you think crews should be doing going forward?
Well, one of the issues is that if you just make the tide window cutoff at 2 hours after high water, and then take 2.5, 3 hours down the tideway, you are at sort of peak flow at Westminster Bridge. And it's getting pretty bad down there, which might be okay for a competent crew in a stable boat. But if you're really struggling, if you're of the lower ability, that's getting pretty dodgy down there and unpleasant.
Yeah. So everyone needs to aim for the beginning of the tide window, right? Is that your advice?
That's my advice is aim earlier. The less confident you are in your schedule, the earlier you should go. There is obviously a sweet spot. The faster crews tend to be more reliable in their scheduling, the more experienced crews are more reliable in their scheduling. And they're the ones that can play around with it. But if you are new to it, aim early. And actually, I think they've got data on Jon Ince's website on canoe race results. There is data that shows how likely people are to go faster than their schedule versus drop off. And very few people go faster than their schedules. It just doesn't happen.
Well, we've talked about the racers who didn't end up making it down the course and that really high 51% attrition rate this year. But it was still those successes that probably stood out to me the most on the top end and the paddlers who did finish and who finished so well. Seeing two mixed crews on the podium was really exciting, and back-to-back years where a mixed gender crew won the race, the really high caliber of athletes competing for the podium, all of them coming from in that kind of top end, top six-ish that we've talked about, all of them coming from international distance racing or Division 1 within the UK, people who've been on Team GB representing their country. And we also saw that as much sort of drama and tight racing there was, I think we did a pretty good job with our Paddlecast preview episode predictions. I will mention one notable exception, which we did predict them as a likely or possible win for the C2 Canadian class of Dylan Kirk and Andy Hall. But they also managed to sneak into the top 10 overall as a Canadian crew, along with the kayakers. And that was pretty exciting for them, particularly when, we had such a strong top 6 and top 10 racing. To get in there as a canoe is very impressive. And they're one of the international crews too, who came over from the United States. I think we've seen such a high caliber of UK based paddlers this year. I'm wondering if we might see more sort of high level international paddlers coming into the race in the future. Billy, where do you think the race is headed from here? Do you think we'll see this kind of high caliber elite level paddler next year and in the coming years? Thank you to our sponsors, Tango Charlie Lights. Tango Charlie offers lightweight lights and brackets that have been purpose-built for paddlers. Tango Charlie was founded because of a close call. Reggie Probst had been paddling K1 and surfski for years when on one early morning paddle in the dark, he was almost run over by a fishing boat because they couldn't see him. He realized that duct taping torches or bike lights to his boat wasn't enough to keep him safe in the dark. So he designed something new. Sleek, lightweight brackets that are easy to put on and take off your boat and stay put while you're paddling. Tango Charlie lights are not boat lights adapted for use on a ski or kayak. They are lights designed and built for paddlers by a paddler. Go to tangocharlielights.com.au to find the right lights for you.
The race has struggled during the COVID times and some years with dangerously high flow. I think we're starting to see a new era of a race emerge. I am expecting a slightly new generation of paddler, and I'm hoping some of the marathon paddlers are going to follow in sort of Joe Peterson, Anoushka Freeman steps. People like George Durden, who did the singles race this year, and possibly sort of some of his peers that are thinking about the end of their international marathon careers might give the race a go. You know, a race that's always been on the circuit in the UK, and they've never done because they've been concentrating on racing hard on a shorter format. But they might give it a go as they turn their backs on 30-kilometer racing and want to really challenge themselves. I did actually, I don't know, could I name drop this person? I was at Kintbury on Friday supporting Radek, who came third in the senior singles, and a really top international paddler suggested exactly what I'm saying, that they might have ended their international career and be thinking about doing DW next year.
Wow. All right. We'll leave that anonymous for now, maybe.
Yeah,
but
yeah. No,
that sounds very
that's
exciting.
exactly why I'm hoping the race goes. I hope this is the same abroad. You know, some top international paddlers could give the race a go. It'd be lovely to get some more paddlers from Europe coming in.
That would be great. And you've actually reminded me of a conversation I had with Tom Sharpe last year, where I remember him kind of saying, you know, he'd worked, and he, of course, he did well on the marathon scene too, right? But he ended up switching over to the ultra scene, right, with races like Devizes to Westminster. And for him, it was a real, almost a revelatory moment of, oh, maybe this is actually what I'm good at. This is a strength I didn't realize that I had. And he's so consistent out there on that really long course over the ultra distance. I know, you know, I think Nushi called him Mr. Tideway too, that he's, you know, one of the few paddlers who even after 100 miles is out there on the rough tideway feeling pretty comfortable and confident in his racing. And so I'd imagine maybe there's some other marathon paddlers out there, especially those who felt like they didn't fully crack the code through their marathon paddling, who could try out ultras and realize maybe that's what they're a little bit better suited for.
Anoushka is probably very similar, and I would put myself in that bracket as well, though I didn't have a successful international career as they did. But we all lacked the top end speed, but what we were good at was the endurance. And that has sort of transferred into DW quite well for all of us.
I think you're right. And I've there's some amazing ultra paddling races around the world. Ultra paddling is a rapidly growing aspect of paddle sports, an area of the sport, really similar to what we've seen over the last few years with ultra running. And I'd like to see a little bit more, I think, cross-pollination. We had the Texans over who'd done the Texas Water Safari, so that's great. You know, we know there's paddlers out there doing the doozy in South Africa. It'd be great if we could get a little bit more sort of cross-pollination between, and those are very, very high caliber paddlers as well. The Alabama 650 is the longest solo ultra paddling race. And I think there's an opportunity, you know, anyone who can do that, you've certainly got the endurance for the ultra that is 125 miles. And on the canoe side, the Au Sable River Canoe Marathon in Michigan is one of, if not the most famous sort of marathon canoe sit and switch style seated canoe races. We've had some paddlers who've won that race come over here for the DW, but it'd be nice to have a little bit more exchange too. So this is, I think this is us kind of calling out anyone who's out there doing some of those amazing ultra races around the world, as well as anyone who, you know, feels like their marathon career needs to be longer. If a marathon feels a bit short to you, come try the ultras. And you know, we've talked about this briefly, but just the fact that we've had two mixed crews on the podium this year. Billy, you actually shared this stat with me that I thought was pretty representative. Over the last 8 editions of the DW, half have been won by mixed crews.
It's something we've been talking about a lot after the race. You know, why are the mixed crews doing so well? And I'm yet to hear a really convincing argument that's not just they're better. You know, they're ranging from, I think you were talking about it on the live stream, that they're lighter so that there's less drag on the canal. But that would indicate that the mixed crews would get caught on the Thames, which they're not. So if anyone listening can tell me why, particularly, well, I've suffered from it twice. Why do the boys keep getting beaten by mixed crews? Answers on a postcard, please. And if anyone, or just contact me directly, because I would really like to know. Don't tell anyone else. And if I can crack the code, then just contact me, please. Jon and I are desperate for a win.
We'll be betting on you next year. Well, I mean, if these mixed crews return, would you be betting on those crews?
Joe and Brindy, I mean, as we've just praised Tom and Nushi, Joe and Brindy came very close to winning on their first go. Joe and Brindy on their second go would be dangerous. You know, Joe has done the race before, but as a crew, it's their first one. It's Brindy's first race. You know, once they've got that experience, you know, Jon said he felt a different person going down the course this year than last. You know, Brindy probably will as well. Like, yeah, I can already tell you that they'll be top of the runners and riders next year if they enter again.
I think you're right. I think anyone, as you saw, Jon experienced that firsthand. He had a much better race this year than last year. You know, when I went from my first ultra to my second, it was a completely different experience. It's really hard to, and before Nushi got in the boat with Tom, she did the nonstop race with a different partner the previous year too. So that was not her first. Yeah. And it does speak to the impressive performance of Brindy to do that on her first go. And as you say, next one, very, very dangerous crew. It's going to be really tough to compete with them. We've talked a lot about the nonstop race on Paddlecast and on, the Paddle Daily channels as well. I've talked a little bit about the stages race too, and I'm just going to give a few quick updates on that. So Billy, you mentioned George Durden, a very high level marathon paddler who won the stages race over 4 days. He won by an hour. Pretty solid win, but his main competition, James Walkington, did manage to pass him just towards the end of day 4 and get one win of the 4 days race. That was on the tideway. Sienna Payne from Chelmsford won the women's race. I think she's still a very young up and coming paddler. So that was really exciting to see from her. And she finished well overall too. And then we saw George Bell out there in high kneel C1, which was incredibly impressive. High kneeling for that long is a real challenge. There's not many people who've done it before. There's certainly a few notable names, and it's Marcus Gohar who has those overall high kneel C1 records that I think George would love to challenge for those, but it was not the conditions or the year for it. But really impressive for George getting down the course. And as you may have seen already from the Paddler Media channels, we had the first official class for stand-up paddle boards. at the DW Stages race. And you've hopefully listened to our interview with Emily King, who was one of those two alongside Patty McCormick. Just incredibly impressive. There were two suppers who went down the course in 2009, but that was, much more of a situation of them sort of asking the race to allow them to go down the course. What we've seen this year, which is a completely different scenario, is that the race directors have said, you know what, we need the SUPs. This is a growing paddle sport. We need them to secure the future of the race. We need to figure out how to make it work. And there's been a ton of collaboration going on behind the scenes between the event organizers and Patty and Emily to make it work. And it was a successful trial by all accounts. So I'm pretty optimistic that coming out of it this year, we'll see more SUPs next year. And the Stages race does now finish upriver of Westminster, which I do think is a bit of a disappointment for some racers. But having been to the location on Monday, it was just a fantastic location, a great place to end the race, and definitely a safer place compared to going a bit further down the tideway. So I'm really optimistic about that feature of the Stages race.
The SUPs, when we spoke to Emily, she said the worst thing that she could have on the race is a headwind. And we had low flow and a headwind this year, and they both made the time cut each day. They weren't the slowest boats on the water, and it proves that it's perfectly possible. SUPs can be in the next year's race, and they need more entries. If that class if the class will keep going, more SUPs need to enter, and Paddy and Emily have proven that it's possible to do. So let's pump it.
Yeah, we'll be throwing out that challenge to the international SUP paddlers and the UK ones too. Of course, it's been proven, it's been done.
Definitely.
So come and challenge those times. Well, Billy, do you have any final thoughts as we wrap up DW and do a little bit of news?
I think we should leave the chat about DW on a call to enter the race. If anyone wants to challenge yourself, get your entries in and get training for next year. It's a great race. Go and do it.
We'll leave the DW there, a call to enter. We don't have a ton of time left, but shall we do, there was another big race happening at the same time as DW that I know we are both following along. Billy, what were the results of the Breeze Ocean race, the surf ski race last weekend?
So the Breeze Ocean race happened over the weekend. They had multiple races, the main one being a big downwind. Flash Gordon won. Dominant win, 8 minutes ahead of Matt Fenn.
An 8-minute win by Gordon Harbrecht is quite a lot. And Matthew Fenn is certainly a good paddler too. What were the rest of the results?
So we had Valentine Henault, the French paddler, just behind Matt Fenn. And then in the ladies' race, it was won by Thais Delroux, ahead of your top pick, Eloha Aishen. And in third place was Britain's Rosie Edwards. I haven't spoken to the other two girls, but I did speak to Rosie. She said it wasn't her best race. The downwind was amazing, and I've watched the videos. It was a good downwind. Rosie is now off to Euro Challenge. Hopefully she's back on form.
Well, we'll be looking out for it. It sounds like the French paddlers did pretty well with Thais winning the women's race and Valentine in podiuming behind two very, very strong international paddlers. So
it was certainly too big for me. I'm glad I was on DW.
Not many paddlers who can say they prefer a DW to a downwind. Should we cover just a couple of upcoming races really quickly?
Sure.
There's a GB assessment race coming up soon. Is that right?
So it's a K2 assessment race in the UK. It'll be the first time this season we get to see our top K2s racing. And I'm going to make an early call. We're 5 months out. Are we 5 months out? I think that our top junior crew could be in with a chance of a medal at the World Championships. And that is Will Short and Alex Morgan. So, I mean, it'd be very unfair to put that much pressure on them at this point, but that's what we do here at Paddlecast.
Having seen them race the watersides, some of the waterside and Thameside series, they are really, really top end for a junior crew. So not to put pressure on them, but I think you're probably making a pretty strong bet there.
We've also got the X-Bay first surf ski race in the UK this season, and that is a selection race for the surf ski team. I'm going to go there. It's very important to get your selection races in with Durban on the horizon this at the end of the year. Well, you've got a SUP race coming up.
Yeah, so by the time this episode comes out, it will have happened, but it's the Battle for Hercules. So we previewed that the other day. We'll have to recap it after it's happened, but I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of it. And then there's another SUP race coming up soon. So Patty McCormick, who we mentioned was just one of the first two SUPs to get down the first SUP category at DW over Easter weekend. Patty has his own ultra coming up soon, which is the 51-kilometer Barrow Blitz in Ireland. And so that is on Ireland's second longest river. And it's home turf for Patty, and tends to be probably a little bit more local, but apparently the scenery is really nice. I've been impressed. I'm always impressed by ultra paddlers who can go from one ultra to the next so quickly. But I'm sure Patty will be having a good race there. So the Barrow Blitz, keep an eye out for.
I've checked the forecast for the South African Surf Ski Championships, which is going to happen in between us recording and editing, and it's not going to be very big. So we bigged up the South African Surf Ski Championships last week, and it's going to be a bit anticlimactic, but it will still be very close racing. It just won't be a howling down winder.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of those top racers who we've talked about do have strong flatwater backgrounds as well.
They're still going to do very well. It's just not going to play into the hands of some people, and it will play into the hands of others.
Remains to be seen. We'll be taking a look at the results of that one too. All right. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. It's been fantastic recapping the Devizes to Westminster. I think we are going to try and talk to the top teams and get them on the podcast as well. So please keep an eye on your feed for those interviews. And until then, see you on the water.
See you on the water.